Have you ever thought about this? What if a revolution that promised a perfect world, a utopia, actually ended up killing tens of millions of people? Well, that is the tragic and kind of paradoxical story of the Russian Revolution. It's this incredible story of a movement that was born from so much suffering, but in the end, it delivered an absolute nightmare.
You know, there's this quote from Herbert Hoover that really nails it. He said, "A nation is strong or weak, it thrives or perishes upon what it believes to be true." And that gets right to the heart of our story today. Because the Russian Revolution, when you strip it all down, was a battle for the minds of an entire nation. It was a battle over belief itself.
And that brings us to the big question, right? The central paradox we're going to dig into today. How did a revolution that was supposed to be for the people end up creating a tyranny against them? It's a huge question, so let's get into it.
Okay, so to really get what happened, to understand the explosion, we first have to look at the pressure cooker. And that pressure cooker was Tsarist Russia in the early 20th century. I mean, you're talking about a massive empire stretching across 2 whole continents, but it was like a society frozen in time. And it was getting dangerously close to its breaking point.
Just look at the contrast here between Russia and the rest of Europe. It's pretty stark, right? While the West was just leaping into the modern age, with industry, radios, new freedoms, Russia was, well, it was stuck. It was a nation of poor, mostly illiterate peasant farmers. And they were ruled by the Romanov dynasty, who made a point of keeping them isolated from the rest of the world.
And that wasn't an accident. No way. This was a deliberate strategy. The czars, they knew that an uneducated population is an easily controlled one. So for 300 years, they kept their people in the dark because they understood something fundamental. Knowledge is power. Knowledge is the key to freedom. But, a situation like that, it can't last forever. And sure enough, a man named Vladimir Lenin saw his chance. He saw an opportunity to bring a really radical new idea to Russia, an idea that would basically weaponize the suffering of the people and completely change the course of history. So what exactly was this radical idea? Well, we're talking about communism. And at its core, it's a system where the state owns and controls everything, all property. The stated goal? To create a society of total equality. And look, that's a powerful promise, right? It's really alluring. But it's also one that, as we'll see, carries a very dark and very bloody history.
Now, here's the thing. Karl Marx, the guy who came up with communism, he thought his revolution would happen in industrialized countries, a big fight between factory workers and their capitalist bosses. But Russia wasn't like that. It was a nation of peasants. So Lenin did something that was frankly brilliant and also devastating. He tweaked the idea. He reframed the whole conflict. It wasn't workers versus bosses anymore. It was just the oppressed versus the oppressors. And in a country like Russia where almost everyone felt oppressed, that message hit home, big time.
So with this powerful new message, Lenin basically had all the fuel he needed for a revolution. The whole country was like a tinderbox. All he needed now was a match to light the fire. And that match, it came in the form of a catastrophic world war. And things escalated so fast. I mean, just look at this timeline. You've got the Bloody Sunday Massacre in 1905, which really showed everyone how brutal the Tsar could be. Then in 1914, Russia gets dragged into World War I, and that was just the final straw. It led directly to the Tsar giving up his throne, and that created this huge power vacuum, a vacuum that Lenin and his party, the Bolsheviks, were more than ready to fill.
I mean, you can't overstate what a disaster this war was for Russia. The army was badly equipped, they were suffering these staggering losses on the battlefield. And then back home, you had massive food shortages, which led to riots and strikes everywhere. The whole country was just collapsing. It was the absolute perfect storm for a takeover.
And right into the middle of all this chaos, Lenin offers this simple, brilliant, powerful promise. Just 3 words: peace, land, and bread. Think about it. For a nation full of starving soldiers and peasants with no land, for a people who were just desperate for the war and the hunger to end, that message was impossible to resist. Absolutely impossible.
So, the Bolsheviks seized power, but the revolution? Oh, it was far from over. What came next wasn't the utopia they promised, not even close. It was a brutal, bloody struggle for control that would end up replacing one kind of tyranny with another, and this new one was way more efficient. So how did they pull it off? How did they win? Well, first, they had to fight and win a horrifyingly brutal civil war. But here's the key. They knew how important information was.
They seized control of the train stations and post offices so they could control the story, the narrative. And finally, they unleashed what became known as the Red Terror, the systematic campaign of arrests, torture, and mass executions targeting anyone who dared to stand in their way. And then, to really cement their victory, to just completely erase the past, the Bolsheviks committed one last brutal act. In a dark basement, they executed the entire royal family, the Tsar, his wife, and all 5 of their children. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov rule ended in a hail of gunfire.
The immediate cost of this, it's just staggering to think about. In just 3 years between the Civil War and all the chaos that followed, more than 7 million people died. 7 million. And you know what the craziest part is? That was just the beginning. Because this revolution, it had unleashed an absolute monster. Over the next 7 decades, the Soviet regime, especially under Lenin's successor, a man named Joseph Stalin, they would be responsible for the deaths of tens of millions more. Through man-made famines, the slave labor camps of the gulags, and just relentless political purges. The numbers are almost impossible to comprehend. So you have to ask, why? Why did a revolution that promised so much end in so much death and destruction? Well, the sources we're looking at for this explainer offer 2 very different explanations for this tragedy, and we're going to explore them both nice and clear. Okay, so the first explanation is a political one. It basically argues that the revolution was doomed because it put absolute, unchecked power into the hands of just a few people. Lenin was a master of using information to grab that power, right? And the Soviet state that he built, well, it just perfected those tools and created a new, much more efficient kind of tyranny.
Then there's a second explanation, which sees the failure as more of a spiritual one. This perspective says the revolution was bound to fail because it was built on a foundation of state-enforced atheism. The argument here is that by officially rejecting God or any higher moral authority, the Soviet state felt it had the green light to treat its own people as nothing more than tools, things to be used and then thrown away.
So, in the end, the story of the Russian Revolution is a huge warning, isn't it? It's a reminder that whenever leaders come along promising a perfect world, a utopia, in exchange for just a little more control, we should always ask ourselves, okay, but what's the catch? Because as history shows us, the price for that promised utopia is often our own freedom.